Welcome to this deep dive on Cashflow Lab. Today we are cracking open some pretty sobering source material. It paints a genuinely worrying picture of the U.S. economy, specifically focusing on these pressure points, these states that could, well, signal a national recession coming in 2025.
Yeah, and we're not just looking at the big picture like national GDP today. This is different. We're going really granular state by state. Our goal really is to identify the 10 states that the data suggests might be the first to, well, to fall, the ones likely to face severe economic problems, fiscal issues, if a big downturn hits.
And this isn't just speculation, right? We've got hard data points here, specific jumps in unemployment, scary drops in state savings.
Critical household debt levels.
Exactly. So we're going to unpack the combination of factors that puts these specific places at such high risk. And crucially, explain why a crisis in, say, Louisiana or Arizona isn't just a local problem, why it's actually a systemic threat to the whole country.
Definitely. And to understand that vulnerability, we first need to understand the metrics being used. Before we get to the list of states, we really have to grasp the foundational issues, the things that created this fragility across the board.
Okay, sounds good. Let's unpack this assessment of the American economy then. Let's start with that bigger national picture that kind of set the stage for these potential localized failures. So the core idea in this analysis is that the huge U.S. economy, this titan, is actually standing on shakier ground than we might think. The sources even say the warning signs, maybe even catastrophic signs, are already hidden in plain sight. What national policies are they pointing to as the cause of this widespread vulnerability?
Well, the primary driver, according to the sources we reviewed, seems to be the Federal Reserve's pretty aggressive strategy, those rapid back-to-back interest rate hikes. They were put in place to fight that stubborn inflation we saw after the pandemic.
Right.
But while maybe necessary, that policy really acted as a major headwind for the economy. The source material calls it a double-edged sword.
Okay, explain that a bit more. How did decisions made, in Washington translate directly into instability for, say, a homeowner out in Boise or an auto parts maker in Indiana?
Sure. So the hikes made borrowing money much more expensive right across the board. For big companies, this meant suddenly those expansion plans looked too costly. Mergers got put on hold, investing in new equipment, new tech. It just wasn't justifiable with the higher cost of capital.
So businesses just stopped investing, stopped growing.
Pretty much stalled, yeah.
Yeah.
And that led to a wave of strategic layoffs, especially in industries that rely heavily on borrowing, like construction or high-growth tech. It's like the economic engine started seizing up because the fuel got too expensive.
Okay, and for regular people, you mentioned it became a crippling household debt crisis.
Exactly. For the average citizen, that tighter money meant a couple of things. First, mortgage rates just shot up. So even if home prices leveled off a bit, the actual cost of paying that mortgage made buying a home impossible for millions of potential new buyers. That slowed the market way down and started threatening the equity people already had in their homes.
Right. And the second thing?
Second, and maybe hitting even faster, was credit card interest rates. Auto loans, too. They just ballooned. And this directly pumped up those average household debt figures we're seeing in so many of these vulnerable states.
Okay, so we've got expensive money hitting both consumers and businesses. But the sources also mentioned that inflation just wouldn't go away, compounding the problem.
Yes, that's the crucial third piece. Stubborn inflation, especially in what economists call non-discretionary sectors.
Non-discretionary. So stuff you have to buy.
Exactly. The unavoidable costs. We're not talking about, a new TV. We're talking about groceries still stubbornly high, fuel, utilities, and maybe most critically lately, things like property taxes, insurance premiums, medical costs, those just keep climbing.
And when those costs go up, it doesn't really matter if you got, say, a 4% raise. Your actual purchasing power is getting eaten away.
Precisely. It leaves millions with basically no financial cushion, no buffer at all.
So that national squeeze on everyone's finances is the underlying pressure that makes any local problem, like a factory closing, potentially catastrophic.
That's it, exactly. The average American is heading into this period already stretched incredibly thin, often relying on credit just to keep things going.
Yeah, and those aggregate numbers cited early in the source material, the ones for these vulnerable states, they really hammer home how bad the distress already is. These aren't hypotheticals.
Oh, the numbers are alarming. For the states in the worst shape, their financial reserves, their rainy day funds, have dipped below 5% of their yearly budget.
5%.
Yeah, we're seeing average household debt topping $45,000. In some housing markets that were booming, values are dropping by $60,000 or more in just months. And the social impact is stark. Poverty rates in the states we're about to discuss are climbing past 20%. These aren't just signs of a slowdown. They look like signals of systemic failure in those areas.
Okay, that definitely sets a grim national stage. Let's move on then to Section 2 and really define the tools, the key indicators used in this analysis to measure that state-level recession risk.
Mm,
Right, before we start naming the states, we need to understand the measuring sticks used here. The analysis really highlights the rainy day fund as a key indicator of resilience. What exactly is that, and why is that 15% benchmark they mentioned so critical?
Okay, so the rainy day fund is basically the state's savings account. It's the liquid cash reserves they keep aside for emergencies. It's usually measured as a percentage of the state's total annual spending. And that benchmark, yeah, 15%, that's generally seen as the level needed for real economic resilience.
Resilience meaning.
Meaning the state can comfortably handle a typical recession, a drop in tax revenue, without having to immediately make drastic crisis-level decisions.
So if a state's got 15%, they can ride out a dip in sales tax or income tax for a few months without, say, shutting down schools or essential services.
That's the idea. Now flip that. If a state only has, say, a 5% reserve, like many on this list will discuss, and their tax revenue suddenly dropped by just 8% because people lost jobs, they have to make brutal choices immediately. Either slash vital services, think cutting education funding right in the middle of the school year, or closing rural health clinics, or try to borrow emergency money, which gets incredibly expensive when interest rates are already high.
So low reserves actually make the recession worse for people in that state instead of cushioning the blow.
Exactly. It forces the state to amplify the pain.
Okay, that paints a clear picture of fiscal instability. Let's talk about labor market health next. We know the national unemployment rate is around, what, 4.1%?
Yeah.
But these vulnerable states are seeing much bigger jumps. What should we look at besides just that headline unemployment number?
Yeah, the rate itself is important, but we need to dig deeper into the concentration of job losses. It's really critical to look at how volatile the main industries are in a state's economy. Is the state heavily reliant on sectors that are super susceptible to downturns?
Like what kind of sectors?
Think tourism, construction, maybe manufacturing of non-essential goods, or even volatile resource extraction like coal or oil. If a state's economy leans too heavily on those,
Yeah.
then its labor market is structurally fragile. When the first wave of cuts hits one of those sectors, it sends ripples across the entire local economy in a way that a more diversified state could probably absorb much more easily.
Okay, concentration matters. We also need to consider overall economic activity and diversity. GDP contraction is obviously a big one.
Yeah, GDP going down, especially those Q1 2025 figures in the sources, that's a clear signal. Demand is falling, production is shrinking. Simple as that.
But what about diversity? How does that play into resilience?
Diversity is like the state's economic immune system. If a state's whole engine depends on just 2 or 3 things, maybe gaming in Nevada or auto manufacturing in Indiana, then its entire fiscal health is basically held hostage by how well those few, often volatile industries are doing.
You need depth and breadth, not just size.
Exactly. A diversified economy can handle a hit to one sector much better.
Got it. Finally, let's talk about household financial stress. This is about the vulnerability of the people living there. We mentioned poverty. The national average is about 11.4%. But let's zero in on debt and housing costs.
Right. So consumer debt per person, and especially rising delinquency rates, people falling behind on credit cards or auto loans, that shows how thin the safety net really is for families. But maybe the most dangerous metric here is the housing burden.
Housing burden.
Yeah, it's the percentage of households spending more than 30% of their income just on housing costs. That includes rent or mortgage, plus utilities, property taxes.
And why is that 30% mark such a critical line?
Because it basically means there's zero room for error. If you're spending over a third of your income just keeping a roof over your head, you have almost no ability to absorb any unexpected shock. A sudden medical bill, a major car repair, losing your job for even a few weeks, it can be devastating.
So a high housing burden means the population is already stretched to the max.
Exactly. It turns what might be a normal economic slowdown into a full-blown personal catastrophe for a huge number of people in that state. That vulnerability, that's often the key difference between a state that just bends in a recession and one that actually breaks.
Okay, with those metrics laid out, let's start the countdown. The first 5 states identified as most vulnerable. Kicking us off at number 10 is Kentucky. The sources call it the affordable sanctuary concealing risk. That sounds like the low cost of living might be hiding some deeper problems.
That's precisely the issue. On the surface, Kentucky looks affordable, yeah. Median home price around $213,000 seems manageable. But the state itself is fiscally quite fragile. That rainy day fund we talked about, it only covers 7.6% of their annual spending.
7.6%. That's barely half the recommended 15% benchmark.
Not even close. They just don't have that institutional cushion to respond effectively when the economy sours.
And the social indicators, the poverty rate, unemployment, they show the pressure's already hitting the workforce, especially in certain areas.
Absolutely. Unemployment jumped pretty sharply to 5.6%. And maybe more telling, nearly 18% of Kentuckians are living below the poverty line. That's almost 1 in 5.
Wow.
Their economy is also contracting. GDP shrank by 0.7% in the first quarter of 2025. And that downturn is directly linked to their heavy reliance on manufacturing, agriculture, and particularly coal.
Yeah, the sources mentioned specific revenues collapsing because of that reliance.
They do. Coal tax revenue specifically plummeted 22% year over year. That's a huge hole blown in the state budget that has to be filled somehow, probably through cuts to services, especially in vulnerable regions like, eastern Kentucky.
And even with that lower home price, housing is still a risk.
It is, because values are starting to fall now, especially around Louisville and in those rural eastern areas. That threatens the home equity people were counting on as a safety net. When people see their main asset losing value, they pull back on spending fast.
Okay, moving on to number 9. We head northeast to Rhode Island. The label here is the oversized recession risk. Suggests its small size is a factor.
It really is a structural problem. Rhode Island is tiny, just over 1 million people. That means a naturally restricted tax base and, frankly, less room for industrial diversity. It just lacks the scale to easily absorb big economic shocks.
And the reserves.
Also low. Their rainy day fund is only at 6.9%.
Let's talk about that jump in unemployment. It went up to 5.4%, which is a big leap from 3.6% just a year before. That sounds like a severe shock.
It is. It shows that fragility with the job losses hitting key sectors like healthcare and tourism pretty hard. But maybe the deepest issue there is the affordability crisis.
Housing again?
Definitely. The median home price is $446,000. Now compare that to the median household income of about $74,500.
Oof. Yeah, that math doesn't work for a lot of people.
It makes housing completely unattainable for huge parts of the population, including many essential workers. And this is driving a really significant debt problem.
We see that debt number $41,700 per capita in consumer debt and rising credit card delinquencies mentioned.
That's the reality for so many working families in Rhode Island. They are literally one lost paycheck away from total financial disaster. And looking longer term, the source material also points out they rank near the bottom nationally for funding their state pensions. A recession could force some really painful choices there, maybe raiding other budgets or even cutting retiree benefits down the line. A nasty secondary crisis waiting to happen.
Right. Okay, number 8 takes us way out west to Idaho, labeled the boom-to-bust story. This state saw huge growth from migration, remote work. But it sounds like that fast growth created its own set of problems.
Yeah, Idaho's growth was explosive, something like an 18% population jump since 2015. But it was maybe too fast, too furious, unsustainable. It led to really strained infrastructure and, crucially, these massively overdeveloped housing markets. The main vulnerability now is that housing bubble starting to burst.
How big was the bubble?
Well, in Boise, the median home price almost doubled from 2019 levels, hitting around $483,000.
Wow.
Now, it's deflating fast. Housing inventory, the number of homes for sale in the Boise area is up 28% just in the last year.
That's a classic sign of a market turning, right? Going from correction to potentially something worse.
It's a major red flag, a potential free fall that could just devastate the home equity people were counting on.
And fiscally, the state doesn't have the safety net for a crash like that.
Correct. Their reserve fund is only 6.1%, putting them among the bottom 10 states nationally. And the vulnerability of consumers is really high, too. 22% of households, nearly a quarter, are spending over 30% of their income just on housing.
The housing burden again?
Yep. Combine that plus the average consumer debt of $37,200 with a rapidly cooling housing market. You get a sharp contraction. Their GDP only grew by 0.5% in Q1 2025. Given how much their population grew, that's basically stagnation. The boom is definitely over.
Okay, number 7 brings us south to Arizona, the desert concealing vulnerabilities. Similar to Idaho, maybe. A lot of growth, especially around Phoenix, but perhaps the underlying economy didn't quite keep up.
It's a similar dynamic. Arizona's rapid growth kind of papered over rising inequality and pushed housing prices up to really critical levels. In places like Phoenix and especially Scottsdale, median prices are blowing past $550,000. Now, set that against a state median income of around $72,900. The affordability gap is just huge and dangerous.
And the housing burden number here is genuinely shocking. 31% of Arizona households are classified as housing burden, almost 1 in 3 people living right on the financial edge.
There's a massive vulnerability. And that personal debt burden is made worse by an inadequate state safety net. Arizona's rainy day fund, just 5.8% of the budget, way below that safety threshold.
So when the job market starts to go south, as the sources say it has, the state just can't respond effectively.
Exactly. That Q1 GDP contraction was 0.9%. And you can see it in the big metro areas. Phoenix lost over 19,000 jobs just between January and May.
In which sectors mainly?
Tourism, retail, and construction took the biggest hits. That construction boom that fueled so much of their growth, it's actively reversing now because of high interest rates. Add in consumer debt at $43,500 per person, with delinquency spiking on auto loans and credit cards. Yeah, the high growth narrative is finished. It's been replaced by acute financial strain for a lot of people.
All right, our final state in this first group, number 6, is Nevada, labeled the high-stakes bet. This one seems unique because of its almost total reliance on one specific, very volatile industry.
Nevada is really the ultimate example of that single industry risk we talked about. Its economy is just profoundly dependent on gaming, tourism, hospitality.
Yeah, the sectors that always get hit first when people cut back on spending.
Always. And Las Vegas is already feeling it, apparently reporting a 13% drop in tourism revenue recently.
And that dependence translates directly into having almost no fiscal buffer.
Pretty much the lowest in the nation, yeah. Their rainy day fund covers a tiny 5.1% of their budget, second lowest overall. And here's the critical structural weakness. Taxes from gaming and sales make up over 60% of Nevada's state revenue.
60%.
So if the casinos slow down even a little bit, the state budget just instantly craters. That risks a massive domino effect hitting public services, schools, everything.
And the housing situation there looks particularly bad, with a lot of homeowners already underwater on their mortgages.
Yeah, the market correction is hitting hard. Median home prices are falling, and inventory is up 34% year over year. But the really critical number, nearly 19% of homeowners in Las Vegas are now underwater. They owe more than their house is worth.
Wow, almost 1 in 5. Imagine being a waiter or a casino worker trying to pay a $438,000 mortgage when your hours get cut or you lose your job.
It's brutal. And the job losses are already staggering. Unemployment's hit 6.3%. Las Vegas apparently shed 22,000 jobs just in hospitality and casinos in the first 4 months of 2025 alone.
Nevada really sounds like a state built for the good times with absolutely zero capacity to handle the bad times. Okay, let's move into the states that are truly, as the source material puts it, teetering on the brink.
Right. This final group, states 5 through 1, these represent the most extreme cases, according to the analysis, where the fiscal and structural weaknesses are most severe and the economic stress isn't just building, it seems to be accelerating.
Starting at number 5, we land in the Midwest with Indiana, labeled the Heartland Stress Fracture. This sounds like a state deeply tied into those sectors, really vulnerable to high interest rates.
Indiana really embodies that manufacturing vulnerability. Its economy leans heavily on automotive production, steel manufacturing industries that get hit hard when high interest rates curb demand for big-ticket items like cars and industrial machinery. You can see that reliance reflected in their contraction numbers.
Yeah, GDP contraction of 1.1% in Q1 is pretty significant. But what about that decline in factory output? What does that tell us?
That 6.7% drop in factory output year over year, that tells you the economic pain isn't just theoretical anymore. Production lines are slowing down, and that leads directly to layoffs. Unemployment jumped to 5.9%, which translates to about 42,000 jobs lost in the first part of the year. And maybe even more concerning, the workforce participation rate, the share of people working or looking for work, fell to its lowest point in a decade. That suggests discouraged workers are just giving up.
And Indiana's problem isn't just the low reserve 6.4%, but also a weaker social safety net compared to some other states.
That's a really critical point in the analysis. The state ranks quite low, like 45th in per capita public health spending. And apparently they have pretty restrictive unemployment benefits.
So when those factory gates close in places like Indianapolis or Fort Wayne,
The public support systems just aren't robust enough to fully support the displaced workers and their families. That almost guarantees poverty and financial hardship will spread faster and deeper. You can already see the stress in the rental market. Evictions are reportedly up 22% compared to last year. Renters, who make up about a third of the population, are really getting squeezed.
Okay, next up, number 4, South Carolina, called the Fragile Rising Star. This sounds like another state where maybe growth happened too quickly, straining resources that weren't that strong to begin with.
Exactly. South Carolina saw explosive growth, fueled by coastal tourism and a big influx of people moving there, migrants, retirees. But that rapid expansion just completely outstripped the state's infrastructure and especially its housing capacity. Just look at the mismatch. Median home price hitting $388,000, while the median household income is only around $63,900.
That's another huge gap. How does that affordability crisis play out for the people living there?
Well, the housing burden numbers are just staggering.
Yeah.
29% of homeowners are classified as cost burdened, and for renters, it's a devastating 42%.
42% of renters spending over 30% on housing.
Yeah. These families are truly living paycheck to paycheck, absolutely no cushion. And the job losses have already begun there, too. The state's main engine's tourism, especially around Charleston and Myrtle Beach, and construction, they've stalled out.
We saw GDP growth basically flatlined at just 0.2% in Q1, and construction starts dropped 18%.
The economic brakes have definitely been slammed on. Tourism revenue is down 11%. And similar to Indiana, the public safety net is pretty thin. Reserves cover only 6% of the budget. South Carolina ranks low in K-12 education spending, 44th, and even lower in healthcare access, 47th. The state just doesn't have the resources to adequately support the 38,000 people who've already lost jobs in hospitality, construction, and retail. The underlying structure is just too fragile, and a recession will expose all those cracks.
All right, number 3 takes us to Mississippi, labeled the perpetual instability. The statistics here sound like they reflect really deep, long-standing systemic problems that the current national pressures are just going to make worse.
Yeah, Mississippi consistently finds itself near the bottom of almost every national ranking for resilience. It reflects generations of deep poverty and chronically underfunded public services. It has the highest poverty rate in the entire country, 19.9%, nearly 1 out of every 5 residents.
And fiscally, it sounds like they have almost no ability to handle an economic storm.
Virtually none. Their rainy day fund covers only 5.2% of the budget. That sheer lack of fiscal capacity makes the economic contraction they're already seeing truly catastrophic. Their GDP shrank by 1.2% in Q1. That's driven by downturns in agriculture, low-skill manufacturing, and a rural healthcare system that's literally collapsing. Hospitals are closing across the state.
The sources also emphasize that the state's basic infrastructure bridges, water systems, is failing even before a major recession hits. That sounds like a huge long-term drag.
It's a structural nightmare. They rank 49th in healthcare funding, dead last, 50th in education funding. And beyond just the funding, you have physical infrastructure crumbling over 1,000 bridges, listed as structurally deficient, the ongoing water system crisis in Jackson.
Right.
A recession means any money potentially earmarked for fixing those essential things just evaporates. It locks the state into this cycle of instability. With a median income of just $51,500 and 34% of residents already housing burdened, people in Mississippi just have nowhere left to turn when things get worse.
Okay, number 2 on this list, Colorado. This one is honestly stunning to see so high. The source material calls it the cautionary tale of growth. How does a state known for, high-paying tech jobs and a booming economy end up second most vulnerable?
Colorado is really a perfect storm example of what can happen when rapid growth combines with severe income inequality and a complete failure to manage the housing supply and cost. Their reserve fund is low, yes, 5.9%, but the absolute killer vulnerability is the housing market. Denver's median home price is an astonishing $631,000.
$631,000.
Yep.
Even with a relatively high median income around $84,000, that price just seems impossible for most people.
It is, and that's why a shocking 37% of homeowners in Colorado are classified as cost burdened.
37%.
Yeah. And rents, they surged 28% in just 2 years. People are stretching themselves incredibly thin just to afford to live there. And that financial stretching has translated directly into the heaviest consumer debt load among all the states in this top 10.
How high is that debt load?
Nearly $49,000 per household on average. It's massive.
And that creates systemic risk when things slow down.
Exactly. Credit card delinquencies are already up 3.1% since late 2024. The state's GDP actually contracted by 0.6% in Q1, signaling a major slowdown hitting their key sectors like energy and outdoor recreation. Colorado's combination of sky-high debt and stratospheric housing costs means that when the layoffs start hitting those high-wage jobs, which they reportedly have in the tech sector, the pain is amplified massively because people have these huge debt payments they still have to make.
A cautionary tale indeed. Okay, finally we arrive at number 1, Louisiana. Labeled simply the system failure. Based on everything we've discussed, this sounds like the place where every single negative indicator converges.
Louisiana seems to be facing just a perfect storm. You have environmental threats, compounding economic problems, heavy reliance on volatile energy prices, deep-seated poverty, decaying infrastructure, and basically zero fiscal safety net. They possess the absolute dead last rainy day fund in the entire nation. It covers a mere 4.3% of their annual spending.
4.3%. That's truly shocking. Essentially no cash on hand to manage any kind of crisis.
None. And the economic contraction there is already the most severe of all 10 states we've looked at. Their GDP shrank by 1.4% in Q1 2025 alone. That's driven by falling energy prices and a decline in offshore drilling activity, which are huge for their economy.
And the impact on jobs has been immediate and brutal.
Devastating. Unemployment surged to 6.6%, the highest on this list. Over 54,000 jobs were reportedly eliminated just since January, mainly in oil and gas, tourism, and shipping. New Orleans alone apparently lost 15% of its entire hospitality workforce in that short period.
And you couple that with a poverty rate of 23%, second highest in the country, and soaring costs for basic necessities like flood insurance, utilities. It seems like the state's inability to fund even basic services is almost a guarantee at this point.
They rank 48th in healthcare, 46th in education. The combination is just toxic. Extreme poverty, crumbling infrastructure people rely on, and absolutely no fiscal cushion. Louisiana isn't just prone to recession. The analysis suggests it's already functionally broken and just waiting for that final economic trigger.
Okay, that is a really stark list. The state-by-state breakdown, the numbers, it's pretty clear. But, if you're listening to this in a state like, say, Massachusetts or California, states that have massive reserve funds, you might still be thinking, okay, things are bad in Shreveport or Jackson, but why does that really matter to me? Why aren't these 10 states just isolated problems?
Yeah, that's a fair question. But what's fascinating and frankly worrying in the analysis is the argument that the problems in these 10 states aren't really unique economic diseases. They're more like the most acute symptoms of a nationwide economic malaise, a malaise driven by those high interest rates and persistent inflation we talked about earlier. These states represent deep systemic cracks in the entire American financial and commercial system.
Systemic cracks.
Meaning the failure of one state, especially one deeply integrated into national supply chains or financial markets, is basically guaranteed to send shockwaves across the whole country. Our economy is just too hyper-interconnected for it to be otherwise.
Okay, let's break down that contagion mechanism. How does it spread? Let's start with what the sources call commercial contagion, the supply chain factor. You used the example of manufacturing-heavy Indiana earlier.
Right. So imagine a significant downturn in Indiana with that 6.7% drop in factory output we mentioned. That economic pain doesn't stop at the state border. Those factories in, say, Elkhart making RV components,
Right.
they rely on raw material suppliers maybe in Ohio, other component manufacturers over in Michigan, and vast logistics and trucking networks that span the entire Midwest. So when those Indiana factories start rolling layoffs, the impact cascades immediately. Those suppliers in Ohio lose orders, the manufacturers in Michigan cut back, the trucking companies have less freight. Job losses ripple outwards, hitting adjacent regions, even if those regions have healthier state budgets on paper.
So the pain from a failing auto parts supplier in Fort Wayne instantly means less business for a trucking company based in Cincinnati. That company then cuts jobs, which means less consumer spending in Cincinnati, hitting local restaurants and stores there, creating this negative feedback loop that spreads regardless of state lines.
Exactly. It can pull entire regions into recession simply through these manufacturing and supply chain links. Job losses lead to less spending, which leads to more job losses. It feeds on itself.
Okay, that's the commercial side. Then there's financial contagion. This sounds potentially even more threatening, more systemic. It involves those shaky housing markets we discussed in places like Arizona and Colorado.
This is the really critical financial threat, and it does have some echoes of, 2008, although the specific mechanisms might be a bit different this time. The core issue is that mortgage defaults, or even auto loan defaults, happening in places like Las Vegas or Denver, don't just stay there. Those loans, especially ones originated by regional banks or lenders, often get packaged together,
Package how?
bundled into complex financial products, things like residential mortgage-backed securities, RMBS, or asset-backed securities, ABS, and then they're sold off to investors all across the country and even globally.
So wait, a pension fund managing retirement money for teachers in New York? Or a huge investment bank headquartered in Chicago? They could actually own a piece of the debt from that underwater homeowner we talked about in Las Vegas.
That's precisely the systemic vulnerability. If the delinquency rates on those underlying loans, which, remember, are already rising in places like Colorado, start to accelerate because of widespread job losses in these vulnerable states, then those bundled securities, those RMBS and ABS products, start suffering immediate losses. This puts stress directly onto the balance sheets of the institutions holding them, potentially major banks, pension funds, insurance companies nationwide.
Which could lead to a credit crunch.
It absolutely risks a systemic credit crunch. When banks start seeing losses in these securities or just get nervous about the risk, they tighten their lending standards everywhere. Suddenly, it becomes harder for a healthy business in Seattle or a developer in Miami to get a loan, regardless of how well their local economy is doing. It starves businesses across the country of the capital they need to expand and hire.
So the credit freeze spreads like a virus through the entire national financial system.
Wow. And we can't forget the psychological part of this either, right? The confidence factor.
Oh, the psychological impact is almost immediate and incredibly powerful. Think about it. As the news cycle gets dominated by stories of widespread layoffs, rising foreclosures, state budget crises like Louisiana potentially facing total fiscal failure, consumer confidence across the entire country starts to plummet. Even households in states that seem economically healthy will start anticipating the storm. They'll pull back on spending, delay big purchases like cars or appliances, try to save more.
And that collective belt-tightening, even if it's based on fear, can actually trigger the recession itself.
Often, yes. That sudden nationwide drop in consumer spending is frequently enough, all by itself, to tip the entire country into a broad recession, validating the initial fears.
So these 10 states, they really are serving as the canaries in the national coal mine, like the sources say. They're showing us where the weaknesses in the system are appearing first. They're a direct reflection of these broader national economic pressures, the high interest rates, the inflation pinch. The foundation of the economy is being seriously tested right now. And the tremors starting in these places, the ones with thin fiscal cushions and populations drowning in debt, they're a stark, measurable warning sign that the entire structure, including those states that seem stable on the surface, is fundamentally at risk of unraveling. Hashtag tag outro estate.
So the conclusion from the source material seems pretty blunt. It's not really a question of if a recession might spread nationally anymore, but more about how far and how fast that contagion will move once these first dominoes, states like Louisiana and Nevada, actually start to fall. The really severe struggles in these 10 states, they just illustrate how systemic fragility driven by those national policy decisions on interest rates and that stubborn non-discretionary inflation has created a situation where these localized failures genuinely threaten a much wider national unraveling.
Yeah, I think the key takeaway for listeners is to look beyond just the headline GDP numbers for the country. You really need to focus on that interplay between the structural weaknesses in your own state or region, things like over-reliance on just one or two volatile industries or having critically low fiscal reserves, and combine that with the level of household vulnerability. How high is consumer debt? What percentage of people are struggling with that housing burden? Those factors together really determine economic survival when times get tough.
So we really encourage you, our listeners, to maybe do a little digging. Analyze your own regional economic landscape using these kinds of indicators. What is your state's rainy day fund level compared to that 15% benchmark we discussed? What's the housing cost burden percentage in your city or county? Understanding those local metrics might be the best way to prepare for what this data suggests could be a pretty serious economic reckoning ahead.
Absolutely. These data points aren't just abstract numbers, they're powerful predictors. They signal where budget cuts are likely coming, where job losses might concentrate, and where financial stress is already deepest. It makes the struggles of these 10 vulnerable states incredibly relevant to everyone, no matter where you live.
Well said. Thank you for tuning into this deep dive on Cash Flow Lab. If you found this discussion insightful and maybe a little concerning, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss future deep dives. And please share this knowledge with others who might find it useful.
We'll be back soon.
We will. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into the complex world of finance and economics.